I am Kim Tracy with the Maxwell James Speaker Agency here in Denver, Colorado. We connect the best speakers with the best events. And our phenomenal guest today is Julie Chance of Action Strategies by Design in Dallas, Texas. Thanks so much for being with me here today. How are you?
I'm great, Kim. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. How's your weather down there? Anything new?
No, it's sunny and cool. Might be warm for you guys, but it's cool for us for this time of year.
Perfect, perfect. Well, after you get 20 inches of snow, I think that most of the country is happy that they don't live in Denver, Colorado right now.
For today or for this week, yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So let's delve right into the topic. This is a very meaty topic that you've chosen: how to have difficult conversations that lead to positive change. Tell me a little bit about this topic and how it plays a part in your work and your daily life.
Well, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart because for a number of reasons. One, I see a lot of my clients struggling with it.
Mm,
I see friends struggling with it, colleagues struggling with it. And what happens when and so we tend to do one of two things when there's a need for a difficult conversation. We either avoid it,
mm,
which allows that elephant in the room to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Or some people, some of us don't really mind difficult conversations that much, and we dive into them a little bit too quickly
okay.
without really thinking about what it is that we need to say. Excuse me, what it is we need to say and how we need to say it so we can get the effect or the outcome, have the impact that we intend to have. So it's something I see so many people struggling with, and the benefits of doing it and doing it well can be so huge that it's worth taking some time
Okay.
to look at and figure out how to do.
Nice, nice. What are some of the critical aspects for preparing for a difficult conversation? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, sure. I can give you a couple of those. Before I dive into that, though, what I'd like to do is set the stage a little bit
Mm,
and set the context so I make sure that we're on the same page, that anybody watching is on the same page. And there's a lot of different types of difficult conversations that we could have, right? And for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to divide it into kind of two buckets.
okay.
One bucket is those difficult conversations where the relationship is going to come to an end. Or so when you're terminating somebody, letting somebody go, doing a reduction in force, where the relationship is going to end. That's different from those difficult conversations where you intend for the relationship to continue,
Mm,
whether that's a personal relationship or a business relationship. You intend for it to continue, but you want some behavior change. You want something different. You need the person to change what they're doing, or there's a disagreement or a conflict that needs to be talked about so that the relationship can continue.
okay.
And those are really the relationships that and the difficult conversations that we're discussing
Mm,
today. And while some of the preparation pieces that I'm getting ready to talk about fit for both, those two conversations, when you're actually in the midst of the conversation, are going to look very different.
different.
So, just so everybody's clear, we're talking about those difficult conversations where you anticipate the relationship continuing.
Okay.
You're going to continue to employ the person. The person's going to continue to work with you.
Okay. Okay. Very good. So, what are some of these critical aspects for preparing for this type of conversation?
Okay, so the first thing to do is to get really clear on the outcome.
Mm,
A lot of the preparation is mindset, or the first part of the preparation is mindset. So you want to get really clear on what's the outcome you want.
mm,
What do you want to be different when this conversation's over? The second thing to really look at is what's your positive purpose?
hmm
And if there's any inkling, if there's even a little bit of to get revenge, to prove that I'm right, to get my way, then you really haven't defined a positive purpose,
hmm
and that conversation isn't going to be as as beneficial. You're not going to have as beneficial as outcome as if you can truly get to a uh, positive purpose. So let me
Okay.
give you an example of what a positive purpose might be. And that might be, let's say you've got an employee that has goals to advance in the company or go in, get a promotion, go into another role. And they've got a behavior. It could be interrupting colleagues in meetings or pushing their own point of view as opposed to listening and getting input and looking at different perspectives. And you know that for them to get what they want, they're going to have to change that behavior. That's a positive purpose because it has something of value in it for both you and for them. So it's a win-win solution. And that's a piece of the preparation, is looking for win-win solutions and a desire to maintain that relationship. That's a critical piece. So they're kind of the mindset pieces. And then we've got some of the more tactical or behavioral pieces. And that includes things like really thinking through what it is you need to say. So what's the point you want to get across? And then how are you going to say it? How specifically do you need to say it in a way that that other person can hear it?
Okay.
Because that's a critical piece of those difficult conversations, is you've got to keep that other person from getting on the defensive. And so how you say it is going to really be a piece of that. And then the third thing I would say in terms of the behavioral preparation is to role play it. Find a trusted colleague, somebody that you're not going to, violate confidentiality issues or anything like that, but somebody that you can actually role play it with, and role play it, and then role play it with a twist. And that twist actually is you play the person you need to talk to. And colleague play, or the person you're role playing with, play you. And what that does, it does a couple of things. It gives you some real insight into the perspective of the other person, and you get the insights of a third party, more objective observer as to how they might handle a situation. And that objective viewpoint's really critical to being able to have that conversation and have a good outcome.
And I love what you said, where you're not breaking confidentiality, and this is somebody that you trust, because that third party is going to give you feedback because you've asked them to participate in this with you.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and you need to be open to that. If you're gonna do it, be open to the feedback that they provide. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot of, it's a waste of your time and their time, not a whole lot of benefit in doing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what are some of the most effective ways that you recommend on how do you begin a difficult conversation?
I think one of the first things you do is you ask for permission. You ask, is now a good time? I've got a couple of things I'd like to discuss with you. I'd like to discuss how the project's going. I'd like to discuss how the meeting went yesterday. And is now a good time? If not, when is? Because that does a couple of things. You want the other person to feel like they have a sense of control. Because when we start feeling like we're losing control is when we tend to get defensive or disengage. So you want them to feel like they have a little bit of control. So asking permission helps to give them that bit of control. Nice. The second thing, though, it does is if they're not in the mindset to do it right then, it's a waste of time. It's going to do more damage than it is good. So give them the opportunity to say, even if it's an employee, even if you're the boss and you have every right to say, right now is when I want to do this. If you've got the option, and most of the time we do, give the person a little bit of time, give them the ability to say, now's not a good time. Now, they also need to let you know when would be and schedule a time that's not a week or a month or a year down the road. But they need to, they need to have the ability. So ask permission. That's the first thing in terms of starting the conversation. The second thing is to use words like, or use approaches like, I want to get your perspective. I'd like to get some feedback from you, so that you hear what they have to say about it before you jump in with your point and what you want to get across. So the third thing probably is to own it, own some responsibility. Hey, I realize I played a part in this, and I want to own that, and I want to see how we can for the future, do this even more effectively. And that's really another piece of it is to look towards the future, because we can't do anything about the past. The past is past. It's we can't change it. All we can change is to do something for the future. And if we dwell too much on the past, it leads to a sense of helplessness because we can't change it. There's nothing we can do about it. So to really focus forward towards the future and how to be even more effective going forward.
Absolutely. Now, this is a tough question because emotions get very heated at a workplace. It's kind of like your work family, if you will. How do you de-escalate a difficult conversation? I mean, we've all heard it where people are going, they are just going at it. It could be a boss and a supervisor, but how does one de-escalate that hard conversation?
So if you're in the middle of a hard conversation and it gets out of hand, or if it's something that's kind of, sometimes these hard conversations, it's nice to be able to do all the planning that I just talked about, but sometimes they pop up on the spur of the moment, right? And be willing to say, hey, we need to step back and take a break here. This isn't getting us anywhere. So let's take 10 minutes, let's take 15 minutes, let's regroup on this afternoon or tomorrow morning. So be willing to do that. And sometimes it takes the self-awareness, it takes the ability to have that awareness that, hey, this isn't working, we need to step out. The other thing is, as a third-party observer, sometimes we're a little bit afraid to jump into something like that. You know, if we're in a team meeting and there's a disagreement gets too heated, it goes towards the non-productive end of the continuum of conflict, is to be willing to say, hey, I think you guys are saying the same thing. I think there's a lot of things you guys are agreeing on. I think we just need to take a break and regroup again in a little bit. So that's the best way to de-escalate, is to actually take that break. And even if you don't take a break, figuratively think about stepping back. So, you know, think as you are in the midst of that conversation and you realize it's not going anywhere, think about, okay, we need to take a step back here. And just that thought of doing that will help to de-escalate it. Somebody has to get control of their emotions and become objective, whether that's an outside party or whether it's one of the two parties in the conflict. If that doesn't happen, then it's not going to be productive.
Very true. I call it get out of the playground, stop throwing sand at each other, and go sit on the bench.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you kind of think about it. If you think about dealing with kids, and not to say that employees or people in the workplace are kids, although sometimes some people
we are.
Act like it, or all of us may at some point, right? We're all guilty of it. So, but to really think about that as a timeout, and it in many ways has the same impact or the same purpose as when you give a young child a timeout, and that's for them to regain their emotional control.
Absolutely. What are some of the words and phrases you recommend avoiding?
Generalizations is one of the things that I recommend avoiding. So always, never. You're always late. You never listen to what I have to say. That's just how you are. This is something that I would expect of you. Those kinds of things get us nowhere. So the more specific you can be, the better. So you want to avoid generalities of always, never. And you want to really focus on the IU ratio. So if I were doing a presentation to a group, a big, an audience, I would want to really focus on the audience and you. So you might understand how I feel. You might have experienced this before. I wish you could have been there. You want to use a lot of yous and you want to limit the I's. When you're in a difficult conversation, you really want to flip that around. And you want to use a lot of I. Okay. From my perspective, it's my opinion. and not use a whole lot of yous. So you want to avoid that, the use of the word you, you, unless, especially if it's could any way be perceived as blaming, because that will put the person on the defensive.
Right. Very
so
true.
Those, but is also a word that you want to avoid, because as a friend of mine says, nothing good ever follows but. And what happens when you say, you really did a good job on that, but it takes away, it totally, anything good you said totally goes away. So replace it with and. So you really did a good job, or there were some things that went really well with that project or with that meeting, with your presentation. And here's some things I think you might think about for the future to make it even more effective.
Nice.
So we put it into the future, use the word even, which predisposes that there were effective things in what was done. So eliminate the word but, replace it with and, focus on the future, and use even more, or even more effective, something like that, are some of the ways to replace that word but that you want to avoid. The other thing to avoid, another word to avoid, is why. And here's why you want to avoid why. If I ask you, Kim, why did you do that? It doesn't matter what tone of voice I use, how much I try to soften it. Here's what you hear. Why in the world would you do something that stupid? It puts, when you ask somebody why in a difficult conversation, it puts them on the defensive, which is one of the things we're trying to avoid. So some ways to avoid using why, or to replace why, is to help me understand. Help me understand your thought process that led you to make that decision. Can you give me a little bit more information on what happened? That way you don't put the person on the defensive. You get background information or contextual information that you may not have had that will help you understand the situation better and how to proceed in the conversation. It keeps you from jumping to assumptions, making judgments.
Okay. Which is very, very important, especially in our society today.
Yes.
Okay. So on the flip side, what are words and phrases that support having a productive yet difficult conversation?
So anytime you can give a specific. So rather than you're always late or you never listen, it's you've been late 3 days this week, or you were late to the meeting yesterday, and that's happened 3 times in the last month. Whatever, to be specific. Or yesterday during the meeting when Susan was talking about XYZ, you didn't let her finish. You interrupted and cut her off, and that shut down the conversation and shut down the group. So as specific as you can be. That's one of the things. Replace but with and, we've talked about. Help me understand, tell me more, ask questions. So any type of a question, as long as it doesn't come across as judgmental, it's great to phrase something as a question as opposed to making a statement.
Very good. And of course, this then dovetails back to that beginning, which is if you're not getting anywhere with these tactics, you might need to take a break. You might need to step backwards, get back on the bench and say, why don't we regroup in a day or so, or whatever is right?
Right. And you may, especially if it's an interpersonal conflict between two, say, colleagues or two teammates, two people at the same level, or maybe not even at the same level, but it has more of an interpersonal working relationship flavor to it. You might need to get a third party to do some conflict resolution with you. And that's perfectly legitimate, acceptable. a great thing to do is, hey, I think we need a third party objective person to come in and help us sort this out.
Yep.
Help see how we can move forward effectively together and achieve the goals we both want to achieve.
Absolutely. So now we're going to delve a little bit into emotional intelligence. How does this help or hinder our ability to have a difficult conversation?
So let me kind of give you a quick definition of emotional intelligence. There's a lot of different definitions or ideas out there, and it can get pretty deep and complicated. But from a very simple perspective, emotional intelligence is about how aware am I of myself and my emotions, my hot buttons, and how well can I manage that? How well do I understand the hot buttons and the perceptions of other people, and how well do I manage those relationships? Okay. So how well do I understand myself, my hot buttons, what sets me off, my strengths, my weaknesses, and how well do I manage that? How well do I understand other people? Right. So if even one person in the conversation has a high level of emotional intelligence, it's a tremendous value.
Okay.
Because they're able to stay in that productive mode in an objective perspective. They also know what their hot buttons are. And once you're aware of a hot button, it's way, way easier to avoid that or to be, oh, they're pushing my button. I just need to step back, kind of regroup. So it's a huge value. Okay. And something that really, if at least one person in the conversation doesn't have some level of emotional intelligence, you're probably not going to have a productive outcome.
Oh, so true. So true. So then we're going into how can an understanding of neuroscience and brain functioning help us improve the effectiveness during these types of conversations?
Okay, so we're learning a lot through neuroscience, and this is going to be like neuroscience 101, remedial 101, because it's going to be a very high level interpretation of neuroscience, and it's something though that really, when I think about this, it helps me understand and brings a perspective to the situation. So hopefully it'll help others as well. But one of the things with neuroscience is we're learning a lot about how the brain functions, and it's leading us to, now I understand why that particular leadership approach was so important, or why something like, say, trust is so important in team development. And I'm just going to talk about like a high-level piece, and that is in our sometimes called the primitive brain, there's something called the amygdala. And the amygdala runs emotions. That's part of what it does. It's also what controls that fight or flight. Some people also say freeze or appease approach to life. So if we feel like we're in danger, and in our modern world, we're much more likely to feel a psychological danger or a psychological attack than a real physical attack, right? But if we have that sense that we may be in danger, which we could have if we're in a conflictual or a potentially conflictual situation, then we're more likely, or we're on edge, and that amygdala is more likely to trigger. Daniel Goleman, who really coined the term emotional intelligence and really brought it to the forefront of out of academia into more the business world and into our lives. He calls it an amygdala hijack. And what happens is that your amygdala takes over, and you've got 4 potential responses at most. Okay. Fight, flight, freeze, or appease. Okay. So flight in a conversation means I disengage. It may mean I get up and leave the room, but more likely it just means I disengage. So I'm still sitting there, but I'm not engaged in the conversation. Fight means I attack. So I get a verbal attack, typically is what it means in our work world. Freeze means I just do nothing. And appease means I'm very agreeable. However, I have no intention of going to do it. It's my way of dealing with an attack, right?
Right.
And to get out of there safely, I'm going to do whatever I feel like I need to do to get out of there safely. So often what happens is you'll sit down in a conversation. The person who's on the receiving end, we'll just call it receiving the feedback, the receiving end, their amygdala is triggered. That triggers the person who was delivering the message's amygdala, and you go into a standoff, basically.
Okay.
Because you can't problem solve, you can't innovate, you can't be a creative when your amygdala is in charge.
Okay.
You have to work from the prefrontal cortex, which is in the front of your brain, which is also called the executive brain.
Right.
And that's where we do our problem solving and our thinking. So when we go into a difficult conversation, our goal has to be, if we want it to be productive, that we stay operating out of our prefrontal cortex, and that the person we're talking to also stays operating out of their prefrontal cortex. And one of the things that I actually do sometimes, and this is something, it's a little bit unusual, some people might think it's a little weird, works for me, it may not for others, is to actually touch the front of my forehead. And it reminds me to focus back towards the front part of my brain. So we get into one of those conversations, if we can just kind of remember to just kind of lightly, it's not a gesture that somebody would even notice, especially if we're in a heated conversation.
Right.
And yet it helps to refocus us and to become more objective and to be able to come back into that area where we can problem solve.
Okay. Tell us about perspective talking and some of the reasons it is such an important skill in having effective, difficult conversations.
So perspective taking is actually the ability to look at the situation from at least two other perspectives. We see the world through our own eyes. And that's not reality.
Right.
That's subjective reality. It's not objective reality. Most things in the world are subjective reality. There's a few things that are objective reality. Like if I climb up onto a building and I drop an egg off the top of the building down to the concrete, it is going to break. And if we know how to calculate those types of things, and we know how far up we are and how much the egg weighs, we can figure out exactly how long it's going to take to hit the ground, right? That's objective reality. But most of our world is not objective reality. Most of it is subjective reality. And I'll tell you a quick story about how this, we know things in our head, but then when we actually know it in our body, when I actually realized this, integrated it into my being, was we're in a presidential election year right now, was in the 1984 presidential elections. I was a graduate student at the University of Texas in the MBA program. So you can imagine that MBAs, business administration, generally, and these are generalizations, generally pretty conservative, generally pretty Republican. I was also taking classes in the Department of Sociology. And you can also imagine that generally, again, these are generalizations, sociology majors tend to be more liberal, tend to be more Democrat.
Okay.
So I walk in the morning into the MBA building the morning of after the election, and it was Reagan and McGovern who were the candidates, and Reagan had won. And there was a celebration. The world had been saved. We were going to make it another 4 years. I went over later that day to take classes in the Department of Sociology, and the world was going to come to an end. The devil basically had just been elected president, and we weren't going to make it another 4 years. Now, since that's been like 30 years ago, clearly both of those were subjective reality.
Right.
Neither was objective reality. It was through a lens, through a specific lens. So perspective taking is being able to look through the lens of the other person. What is going on for them? What might their perspective on the situation be? And really realizing that most reality is subjective. Very little reality is objective, especially when we're talking about what we might encounter in a difficult conversation. So So to be able to look at it from the eyes of the other person and to be able to look at it from the eyes of an objective observer. So what would somebody that's a fly on the wall, what would they say about this situation? How would they describe it? And they're probably going to use many fewer, much less emotionally laden words. And that's one of the things in perspective taking, especially when you take the perspective of an outside objective observer. How can you describe what's going on without using emotionally laden words and describing specific behaviors? If I say somebody got angry at me, I'm saying that based on behaviors, right? I don't know. It's an emotion. I can't see that emotion per se. I can only see the behaviors that are the outcome of it. So rather than saying they got angry at me, say things like their face got red, their voice got louder. Even to say he yelled at me or she yelled at me is an emotionally laden word. To say their voice got louder has much less emotion in it.
Okay.
So to try to describe that situation in your head with less emotionally laden words, that's one way to take those different perspectives. Another way to take a different perspective on it, and the perspective of the other person, is what else could be true. So a number of years ago, I was on a flight, I don't know where, it was a flight from back to Dallas from somewhere. I was on my way home. And I thought the flight attendant, it was a small plane, and I thought the flight attendant was just being a real jerk. And he was really irritating me. And, I thought he's bugging passengers. He's being too nitpicky. He's being rude. And it was really irritating me. And the trip wasn't going to be pleasant.
Oh, boy.
That's how I was feeling, right? So I said, okay, what else could be true? What else could be true about this situation other than he's a jerk? And what I came up with is maybe he's new to his job. Maybe he's just overly conscientious and he's trying to do a really good job. That changed my whole attitude towards him, changed my whole experience of the flight. Now, both of those were stories. If we're going to make up stories, and we make them up all the time about situations, based on a little tiny bit of information, we make up this big story. If we're going to do that, we might as well make the story positive.
Okay.
Because it will make the interaction go more effective. And the reality of it is most people don't set out to make life miserable for other people. That's just, most employees don't get up and go to work today saying, I'm going to see how I can mess up so I can make it miserable for my boss and miserable for my coworkers,
right?
And by the way, miserable for me. Not what we. So to be able to look at what else is true, what else could be true, not what else is, what else could be true, and that's a big distinction because we don't necessarily have to believe it. We just have to say it's a possibility.
Okay. Yep. And being open to saying that, which takes a big level of humbleness too.
Yes, absolutely. And humility is actually one of the cornerstones, I think, of emotional intelligence. Being humble, being able to, and empathy, having empathy, two cornerstones of emotional intelligence.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this great interview, what are some of the mistakes and missteps that commonly occur during difficult conversations?
I think one is not taking that time out, and there needs to be a timeout taken. The other is placing too much blame on the other person and coming across as blameful. A third is to barge into it without taking time to do that planning. And if you go through it enough, you spend enough time thinking about what's my outcome, what's my positive purpose, what's my value on the relationship here. You can do that split second in your head, even in the midst of a conversation,
right,
when you've practiced it enough. So expecting the other person to see your point of view without seeing their point of view, I think, is a big mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And then one of the other big mistakes that we haven't talked about is a failure to separate intention from impact.
Mm.
And we touched on that a little bit, but a lot of times we'll see the impact, we'll see the outcome of something, and our assumption is that that person intended, that their intention was not good. Really, and this goes both ways, really, their intention was probably good. The impact they had is what was negative.
Right.
And as when you take it from the other side, you can't just say, well, my intention was good without looking at my impact.
Mm-hmm.
One of the examples I like to give to that is if I'm out playing catch with a baseball with my nephew, and one of us throws the baseball through a car window. We didn't intend to do that, right? But the window's still broken. There was an impact. So I think it's really important that we separate intent from impact, both in terms of what our intentions are and understanding the impact, and then being careful that we don't ascribe a negative intent to a negative impact that somebody else has.
Very true. Very true. Thank you so much for being with me here today. How can our viewers find you, follow you, or get in touch with you?
Oh, there's lots of ways to do that. It's the age of social media, right? So Twitter, my Twitter handle is Julie C. Chance, so my name with the middle initial C. Facebook is Action Strategies by Design. LinkedIn is just Julie Chance. Looks like we could have gotten all these the same, right? And let's see, my website is www.strategies-by-design.com. And of course, they can always get hold of me through you at the Maxwell James Speaker Agency. And you know your URL for that better than I do.
Perfect. So if you would like to book Julie for a professional speaking engagement, please contact me, Kim Tracy, through maxwelljames.net. Thank you so much again for being with me here today.
Thanks for having me. Great fun as always.
Always. Excellent.